Welcome to this Razor End of Year special. 2021 has been a year dominated by the two Cs, COVID and climate change. While progress has been made on the vaccination front, the same cannot be said for climate change. Despite the urgent calls for action at COP26, we are still far from a united international policy to combat the coming climate emergency.
But while it would be easy to slip into pessimism, here at Razor we prefer to remain optimistic and search instead for scientific solutions.
So, in this episode, we're going to present to you groundbreaking examples of when scientists and politicians came together to tackle our environmental problems head-on and succeeded.
We begin with acid rain. Okay, Emma, I'm just going to put my holographic phone over here.
Oh, fancy. Do you know how to work it?
I do.
Oh.
Spent all last night working on it. Takes a while.
Oh.
Here we go.
At its worst, acid rain emptied lakes of life in North America, stripped forests in Europe, and harmed the health of people and crops in China. Fossil fuels were the cause. Sulfur and nitrogen oxides emitted by cars, industrial plants, and coal-burning facilities. When these pollutants combined with water and oxygen in the atmosphere, they transformed into sulfuric and nitric acid, which increased the acidity of rain, hail, and snow. Acid rain peaked in America in the late 1970s and in Europe in the 1980s, but the international community came together to address the problem in 1972 at the UN Conference on the Human Environment. In 1979, the Geneva Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution created the framework for reducing air pollution and acid deposition in Europe. The agreement has been extended since America signed the Clean Air Act in 1970, with amendments in 1990. Reductions in acid deposition stemmed from these agreements.
Professor John Smol is the Canada Research Chair in Environmental Change at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and was active in bringing awareness to the issue of acid rain, leading to those agreements just mentioned. Professor Smol, if we talk about acid rain, have we won the battle yet?
Acid rain in many respects is a success story. It's not a total success story, but it's definitely when you look at all our environmental problems, I think most scientists would say it was quite a success, and it showed that you can actually get concerted international action and get positive results.
So when you say it's a success, how did that come about?
The industries causing acid rain were quite happy to use the atmosphere basically as a sewer and not pay for it. So there was just a lot of pushback like we've also had with climate change. What we had to show is that, for example, lakes have really acidified, and that's hard to do. How do you show a lake is acidified since the 1800s? Well, the function pH, the acidity scale, was only invented in 1909. So no one was measuring how acid lakes were in the 1800s. So we had to show that. And my lab and labs also in the UK and other places developed approaches to do that. We basically used fossil sediments in lakes. And we could show, because of how the fossils changed, we could actually reconstruct how the acidity levels of lakes changed. So we could show the lakes acidified. Then the next question, okay, now you've shown they acidified. They've acidified, but it's not our fault. So then we have to show it was their fault. And then you have sometimes a third phase. Okay, it is our fault, but it's too late or too expensive to do anything. There's a lot of similarities to climate change. First, denial of a problem, then a problem, but it's not our fault. Then it's our fault, but what are we going to do about it? The acid rain story showed you could get international agreements. It's a much simpler problem than climate change, but you could get international agreements, you could get significant legislation, and you could put a price on pollution, and it worked. I mean, typically what happened, like in the United States, it was a cap and trade system.
So tell us how the cap and trade system works.
The cap and trade system, they said you could only have so many emissions, and either you get to those emissions or put it simply, pay another industry that hasn't used their quota, and so you use some of their quota of emissions. But you're capping emissions in this way. So a country can only release so much sulfur in that case. I'm simplifying it.
So then you push it down, so you're allowed a lesser amount each year, right?
Yeah, it depends on the legislation, but yes, the idea would be to push it down, and because you start off, you give time for the industry to adapt, to mechanize, to innovate, and find different ways that they can keep doing their industry without releasing pollutants.
Okay, you've taken me right to my next question. First, there needed to be a technological fix, didn't there, to get rid of the sulfur or nitrogen emissions from chimneys or any other type of emissions?
That's true. The technology was already there when I started. Most of it was there. It was expensive. It came down to money. It came down to basically this is going to cost money, and right now it doesn't cost us money to just release it into the air. So it was legislation that said, no, whatever way you do it, you've got to reduce your, in this case, acid emissions, and it worked. And in fact, and I heard all this is going to be doom and gloom in the economy. Well, it hardly was. It wasn't at all. Hardly the 1990s were doom and gloom. And also the companies, they innovated. They had all sorts of new jobs, new products. They're still going very strong. So I think there's a real reluctance to innovate, especially when you're making money fairly simply. But I think it's another example that if you force the hand, it is not necessarily economic ruin. People will innovate. You even see this at COP, how all these, sort of like the trade show part of the conference, and all this incredible stuff going on, and really tripling their products every year, and really, these are really, the green industries are really growth industries. But there is reluctance to shift from something that makes money without changing too much.
So what's the lesson for climate change?
Climate change is a much bigger issue. It's a global issue. It's not a regional issue, if you like. And it's far more complicated. I'm not saying it's not complicated, and complex problems require complex solutions. So we have to innovate, but its timing is very, very late. Really, we follow the process. First you need sound science, and we got that in acid rain, and we've had the sound science long time now. Though more science keeps coming in, but we've had the science in for some time. I'm very adamant about that. Then you need to communicate that science, like we had to do with acid rain, which was new at our time, but we had to communicate that science effectively to policymakers, politicians, and the public at large. I think we've been doing a better job now. We had practice with acid rain, and we've been doing it with climate change. Though I think we've reached a place where, at least listening to politicians, let's see the actions, but at least listening to politicians, even conservative politicians who were perhaps somewhat critical of climate change issues, are now, I think purely because they won't get reelected, have taken a much more serious stance on it. But we have a long way to go. I'm talking from a purely selfish human perspective. We have to get our act together and get together fast. I'm not saying it's too late to take action, but it's very, very late.
You can see more of Razor on our YouTube channel. Search for Razor Science Show and it will take you straight there. Remember to subscribe and hit the bell button for notifications. Welcome back to this Razor End of Year special, where we are looking at how we have dealt with extremely pressing environmental problems in the past. In part one, we looked at the issue of acid rain. Another problem the world faced and is still facing is that of ozone depletion.
Most oxygen in the atmosphere exists as O2 molecules made up of two oxygen atoms. When these are hit by ultraviolet light from the sun, mostly at high altitude, they result in highly reactive O3 or ozone molecules. It's this reaction that forms the ozone layer, which is a very effective barrier between the Earth and harmful ultraviolet radiation from the sun. If the ozone layer didn't exist, not only would there be more skin cancer and cataract cases, but our plants' photosynthetic processes would also be disrupted. In 1985, scientists from the British Antarctic Survey noticed there was a large and expanding hole in the ozone layer above the Antarctic. This was caused by man-made chlorofluorocarbons, also known as CFCs, which were widely used as aerosol propellants, refrigerants, for foam blowing, and as industrial solvents. The chlorine from the CFC strips ozone molecules of one oxygen atom, stopping their role as a barrier to ultraviolet. One of these chlorine atoms can destroy as many as 10,000 ozone molecules. Thankfully, scientists raised the alert and world leaders united to back the 1987 Montreal Protocol. By 2010, the Environmental Treaty had phased out most ozone-depleting chemicals in favour of CFC-free replacements.
Joining us now is Dr. Anna Jones. She's the science lead of the British Antarctic Survey's Atmosphere, Ice and Science team. Dr. Jones, how big is the ozone hole now compared to when it was first discovered?
Bigger, much bigger. At the moment, the hole is what you might call saturated. It's not likely to get a lot worse because all of the ozone that can be destroyed by this mechanism has been destroyed. There are winds that flow around the Antarctic continent. They're westerly winds and they spin round and round and round. And there's a sort of vortex which cuts off the air over the Antarctic from the air at other latitudes. And that vortex is basically what contains this air that's very low in ozone. And that's what determines the size of the ozone hole now.
So is it healing?
It is healing. It'll heal very slowly because it only heals when the concentrations of chemicals drop, but it'll take quite a long time. It was very interesting if you look at the data, the hole itself. So it forms every spring, and then in the summer, because these wind systems change, this vortex breaks down and air from lower latitudes mixes. So then the hole itself disappears, but it forms again the following spring, and then it mixes and it disappears, and then the next spring it forms again. If you look at the early data of when the hole formed, it actually formed very, very rapidly on a year-by-year basis, but it's going to take quite a long time now for it to disappear. The key is that these chemicals in the atmosphere, the concentrations have to go down. Some people think they're seeing recovery. But because there's a lot of variability from one year to the next, it's quite difficult to pin that down. But we will know that we are on the right path when the concentrations of these ozone-destroying substances drop. That's the absolute fundamental to all of this.
So why did the Montreal Protocol work, and how can we apply those lessons to what we're facing now?
That's a really good question. So I think the Montreal Protocol worked because in some senses, the problem was relatively easy to solve. So ozone was being destroyed by a group of chemicals which were being produced by chemical industry. They were able to find alternatives to those chemicals. And so they were able to switch from the ozone destroying compounds to compounds that did the same job or a similar job and that didn't have the same effect or as much of an effect on ozone. So the chemical manufacturing industry bought into this quite quickly. We were using these chemicals in products which we bought from the manufacturers, if you like. We didn't care what drove an aerosol as long as if we had an aerosol spray can, I don't care what the propellant is. I just want whatever is in it to go psh and come out. And so the chemical manufacturers were able to make changes to the propellants. We still got what we wanted and needed from our aerosols, for example, and we were able to address this environmental problem. One of the strengths of the Montreal Protocol was that there was a clause in it that it had to be revisited. So the first Montreal Protocol, the agreements within that was very, very much a starting point. So although it would bring down the concentrations of chlorofluorocarbons, it wasn't doing enough. But because there was a clause in the protocol, it had to be revisited. So you had a number of amendments and adjustments, and each one tightened the protocol more and more and more till you got to the point where actually these compounds that were destroying ozone were controlled to the extent that the concentrations were really coming down. And that's when it really started to, properly bite.
So how could we apply that success to what we're facing now? Or is it the fact that the climate change is just too big, too complicated, and there are too many countries and too many voices?
I think that is what makes it complicated. So finding alternatives to the compounds that destroyed ozone was relatively straightforward. Finding alternatives to effectively the energy system that powers the globe, that is not a small ask. And of course, having fossil fuels has enabled us to develop a very sophisticated societal system. We now think that that's the only way to live. We need to live this way. When I look back, if I think back to the 1960s, 1970s, we lived very differently, but we've forgotten that. So now we live as we do today, and we take that for granted, or we think that's the way that we need to be doing things. So the idea of asking people to change their lifestyles is complicated. So we look for alternatives to fossil fuels, and they are not obvious, all of them. There are some fantastic renewables. Obviously, solar energy is fantastic. Wind energy is brilliant. Globally, we can do other things as well. We can do concentrated solar power in the latitudes closer to the equator, where you get fantastic, strong solar irradiance that can be amplified and captured in all sorts of extraordinary ways.
So if we go back to the Montreal Protocol, we had politicians, scientists, officials, they all came together. Have we seen a change in that sense?
There's momentum which there didn't used to be. In the past, the industry was waiting for government to draw up guidance. They wanted to know what the goalposts were, then they could create their strategies and they could work towards them. I think that industry is now listening to the public, and the public want this. And so I think that working together with government, industry and government will make progress on this. The question really is the timescale, whether things can move quickly enough, and across scales, whether this is something which takes all of the leading emitters basically to grasp this problem and to move forwards on it.
You can see more of Razor on our YouTube channel. Search for Razor Science Show and it will take you straight there. Remember to subscribe and hit the bell button for notifications. Welcome back to our end of year special, where we're looking at how the world has reacted to previous environmental crises. In part one, we looked at acid rain and the international agreements that led to solutions and the lessons these can have on climate change.
Professor Guus Velders is a senior scientist of air quality and climate change at the National Institute for Public Health and a professor at the University of Utrecht. He was named one of Time magazine's most 100 influential people for his work on how the chemicals that cause the ozone hole also have a role in climate change. Professor Velders, I don't think many of us understood that ozone depleting gases are also global warming gases, right?
That's right. CFCs are not only ozone depleting chemicals, they're also potent greenhouse gases. And in publications, I think in 2006, together with American scientists, I pointed out the importance of the CFCs for climate change, and in fact, how much we already saved for climate change by the Montreal Protocol. Now we have, of course, the Paris Climate Agreement, but before that, we had the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol was the first global agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And what we found out in our 2007 publication, that the Montreal Protocol saved more in terms for climate, about 5 to 6 times more than the Kyoto Protocol did, which was designed protecting climate.
Okay, that means that these are very potent greenhouse gases then.
Yeah, compared, for example, with CO2. CO2 is, of course, the most important greenhouse gas because the emissions are so large. But per kilogram emitted in the atmosphere, the CFCs are about 5,000 to 10,000 times more potent as a greenhouse gas per kilogram emitted in the atmosphere.
So is anybody still producing CFCs? Are they still making it into the atmosphere?
CFCs are still being emitted, but they're not produced anymore. At least they're not allowed to be produced anymore. And they're still emitted because they're still in old refrigerators or old air conditionings or in buildings which were with spray foams, which we used for insulating foams. They still get out of the foams there. So they're still being emitted, but in much lesser extent than it was in the 1980s and 1990s.
So it's going to take a long time then till we get to the point where none of them are leaking out into the atmosphere.
Exactly. There are long time delays always. First, for example, when you have an air conditioning, it takes about 10, 15 years before the CFC to get out of the application. And that's just when the equipment gets on the landfill or so, when it's destroyed. When it's in foams, it can take even much longer because in a foam, it's usually closed in there. And when you punch a hole in there or you break down the building, then it gets emitted. So there's a long time delay between the production and the actual emission in the atmosphere. And then there's another time delay because these chemicals also have a very long lifetime in the atmosphere. They have a lifetime of about between 50 and 100 years in the atmosphere. So when once emitted, they stay there for 50 to 100 years. So it takes a long time to get rid of the atmosphere and to diminish the effects on the ozone layer.
Has there been any more progress since the Montreal Protocol?
Yes, the Montreal Protocol is still a very active protocol. In 2016, there was a global agreement. In fact, there was a global climate agreement under the Montreal Protocol to phase down the use of hydrofluorocarbons. HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, are now the alternatives being used instead of both the CFCs and their first class alternative, the HCFCs. Hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, do not deplete the ozone layer, but they are potent greenhouse gases. And if they would have kept unabated, so they would have kept growing in their uses, then they could also have contributed to global warming between 0.3 and 0.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And now with the 2016 Kigali Amendment, which is called the phase down of HFCs, this will be mostly reduced. So HFCs will also be phased down in the coming 20 years, which will be a big step also for climate. It doesn't save climate, but it's a big additional step also protecting our climate system.
So if we're talking about an overall increase of 1.5 degrees, then 0.3 or 0.5 is quite a lot, isn't it?
Exactly. A few tenths is a big step when you're talking about the 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius Paris Agreement, yes.
Okay, now we've got a question for all three of you. When I was a boy, I used to say to my father, there's an ozone hole, the acid rain's going to destroy all the forests, there's nuclear war. And he would say to me, Neil, it's going to be all right. We'll start with you, Professor Smol. What would you say to a 12-year-old today about climate change?
That's a very tough question. I'm hesitant to say it will be all right because we already know it won't be all right. We already know there's enough greenhouse gases that we put into the atmosphere that there are going to be changes. What we're fighting for is not to have the most serious changes. So I guess what I would tell a 12-year-old saying, there are going to be challenges. There's been challenges in human history before. Humans have been shown to be very resilient when they need to be. And they've also shown to be innovative. And so I would say that I can't tell you it's going to be totally fair sailing, but with positive and enthusiastic action based on evidence, based on science, you can see this through.
Dr. Jones, what would you tell a 12-year-old today?
It's a good question. It's a very hard one, actually, to answer. You know, I think anybody who has a child, you know, how would you address that with them? I think you would say it's something that we all have to work on together. You don't want your children to get sad or worried. You want them to be optimistic and positive and hopeful, because then they will enact change. If they're worried and to a point where they just can't, you know, they feel that they're powerless, that's not what you want. You want them to feel empowered to make a change. And I think the message would be, if we all work together, we can do something about it. I think that's probably what I would tell. My child is not 12 anymore, so I'm beyond that. But if I had a 12-year-old, that's the way that I would present it to them. We need to work together.
Professor Velders, what would you tell a 12-year-old?
The increase in greenhouse gas emissions is really a threat for our planet, for living on our planet. The good thing is that people are taking it now seriously. When we looked at, for example, going back 12 years ago, there was a meeting in Copenhagen, which was supposed to be a big decision for climate change. It was a complete failure. And the years after that, there was no attention to climate change at all. We had the ClimateGate scandals that people said it was all a scam. Now, at least most people believe that climate change is happening, and also most politicians are very serious about doing something about it. So that makes me optimistic. In 10 years' time, the mindset of most people has completely changed. So yes, a lot of things has to be done, but at least it's taken very seriously now by both the people in the street and also by the politicians.
Thanks, Professor Velders, and thank you all for your contributions. We greatly appreciate it. Now, we know there's a lot we didn't cover today, but the point was to show what can be achieved when we have international agreement and concerted effort.
Which is backed by science and data, of course. We also know that these problems have not gone away. The ozone is only beginning to heal, and the agreements to protect it must be constantly revisited.
And the same goes for acid rain. Despite emission reductions, affected ecosystems have been slow to recover.
which is a reminder that we constantly need to work together to repair the damage we have already done to our precious planet. That's it for this edition and this year. Stay safe, and we'll be back with more science technology innovations in 2022.
See you there.
So I was thinking maybe I could get one of those holographic phones.
Oh, I'd think twice about that. It really chews through the batteries.
Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and hit the bell button below for notifications. We'll see you next time.